Okay, everyone, we're going to get started with the second panel now. Really nice to see so many people back and some new faces joining us. So we're really excited to welcome two live speakers here, both who are joining us from overseas. First, we have Katarzyna Ancuta, who is a lecturer at the Faculty of Arts at 𝘗𝘳𝘳𝘐𝘕𝘚𝘛 University in Thailand. She is also, I suppose, one of the leading experts in the Gothic in Asia.
Well, in Asian Gothic for sure.
Yes. So we're very lucky to have her here. And of course, Gabrielle Lee, who is one of the artists who is showing at the RGS site. And Elizabeth actually directly drew on Katarzyna's work in thinking through her installation. So this is going to be, I think, a pretty interesting conversation, a lot of things for them to talk about. But yeah, please join me in welcoming Katarzyna and Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone, to all the organizer for inviting me, and to Elizabeth. I'm totally humbled that you found my work even. Let me just tell you a couple of things about Asian Gothic. So I was asked to contextualize the discussion. So first of all, before I embark on this kind of a little presentation, which is talking specifically about animism, the whole idea of Asian Gothic is something I've been working on for more than 20 years right now, and it is a search, right? I mean, I've been chasing after Asian Gothic and trying to figure out what that is. And of course, from the very beginning, once you start dealing with that subject, you end up with people being very kind of vehemently opposing this idea. I mean, on the first hand, you're hearing people saying, well, Gothic is just this Western thing, and you're like colonizing, you know, stuff and bringing it over here. And then they're saying, well, also, like, what do you mean by Asia? I mean, Asia is so diverse and everything that you've got. To which I usually say, well, if I want to talk about it, what do I call it, right? I mean, I cannot just list every single country and every single, so let's just call it a useful shortcut. And I'm definitely not trying to impose any kind of, you know, Gothic ideology onto the text that I'm looking at. It's not a genre that I'm trying to categorize. I mean, nothing to do with 18th century British novels of any sort, right? But what I want to see this Gothic idea, this Gothic escaping the confines, you know, of categorization, because I mean, it kind of doesn't like categories anyway. And I see it more as a process of reading all kinds of texts, because I work mostly with films, but also with literature, occasionally dabble in arts and other kind of visuals. And I try to basically explore where it takes me. So I wanted to, you know, to take us a bit closer to the topic of nature, to the topic of, you know, environment, and the way that I think Asian texts and Asian media can add to our understanding of Gothic now in the 21st century. The slides are kind of mostly images taken from commercial films, because I work mostly with cinema, but I think that they match with what we are discussing here. So I wanted to begin from a very tiny fragment of a clip from a Malaysian movie, not a horror film, but let's see how that works. Oh, is it playing? It's playing here, but I don't see. Okay. Yeah, sorry, art movies. So if you cannot see, what you see is a little wooden structure, and now something emerges from that structure.
Sinar mencerang akan mukaku, bintang di akan mataku gajah jantan akan badanku ular panjang akan sandalku.
Okay, I'm just going to stop this here. Sorry, a bit abrupt, but the clip is a bit longer. So what really drew me to that clip was the clip is from a recent Malaysian movie which deals with shamanism, right? And it kind of struck me that if I saw this film 20 years ago when I first came to Asia, I would have interpreted it in a very, very different way. I mean, I would just see a structure in the fields, maybe somewhere where workers are resting. I would see a person who eats a meal. I would see a person who is acting weirdly, perhaps being, I don't know, disturbed in some way, right? But today when I look at it, it's obvious. It's a spirit house. It's a spirit, right? We are watching a non-human creature just basically going around its thing. And it kind of struck me that it is something that I have accepted, and it's something that I don't find strange anymore, right? And that brings me to the notion of animism, because what I notice is that in a lot of Western Gothic texts, I mean, there is now a certain tendency to move towards what they call the new animism. But what you see here is are these two quotes which show you the difference. So in most of the newer texts, the theorists would be moving away from the accepted definition of animism that comes from 19th century texts like the text of 𝘋𝘳𝘪𝘷𝘦, which basically calls animism a belief in spirits. And that is the idea that is seen as primitive, as something that we kind of moved on to. And then there are those very philosophically defined new ideas of animism, talking about subject-subject ontologies, and the kind of way that we see ourselves in the modern human world. But we're in Asia, and we're in Southeast Asia, and, well, there are spirits, and people still believe in spirits, right? So how do we go about it when animism is is not only something that is pre-modern, but animism is something that has kind of embedded itself into the very modernity that we look at. So what I like from the new definitions that you find very often in the eco-critical texts and eco-Gothic texts, is this notion of looking for the animate world, the world where the humans are extending their relationship to other species and to also creatures that are non-human in a sense of not just being animals or plants, but also being spirits, right? But of course, in the Gothic concept, these kind of relationships are always the opportunity for something terrifying, for something uncanny, for some kind of meetings that are, unnerving in some way. And so it brings us very often into the forest, right? Gothic has got a long tradition of looking at forests as the source of fear. I mean, you have the stories about the deep, dark woods, right? I mean, there's always something in the deep, dark woods. Is it a witch? Is it a monster? It's something, right? And so there is this archetypal story about, entering this kind of hostile natural environment. But if you look at the tropical parts and if you look at the forest from the eco-Gothic perspective, now what really kind of strikes you is that Gothic is a lot about excess. And when you come to the tropics, there's nothing more excessive than being in the tropical jungle, right? I mean, it's like when you first see the banyan tree, when you first see the sai tree, right, it just grows in all these different directions, right? I mean, how can it not be haunted? How can it not be alive? I mean, when you have these structures kind of coming out of there, right? Obviously being next to this kind of very wild, untamed nature that is also affecting our cities, that, you just leave something outside in the garden for a couple of weeks and it's gonna be overgrown, right, immediately. That is something that is a very ripe area for kind of exploring eco-Gothic potentials. Now, at the heart of the eco-Gothic writes, the term of ecophobia, right? Ecophobia got introduced to us through a very influential essay of Simon Estock in 2009 that was I mean, quite controversial at the time. He describes ecophobia as an irrational and groundless hatred and fear of the natural world. And he says that it's become a bit of a discourse, right, in our lives, in a lot of disciplines that we see. But when I started thinking about that, again, in contrast with Asia and with other things, there's a very distinct way things are treated here. So one of the earliest kind of texts in cinema which were dealing with problematic nature came after the Second World War under the guise of atomic era movies, right? So we were all kind of worried about the power of the atom bomb and what it's going to do with the environment. And American cinema gives us all these kind of huge creatures. One of the best films of that period is Them, which gives us, huge, massive ants. Now, when the ants are introduced, they're introduced through the terrified little girl who can only say, it's them, right? So that rhetorics of them versus us, we need to kill it, we need to get rid of it. In these wonderful shots, you've got the army, blasting the ants and trying to get rid of it. Now, around the same time, Ishiro Honda is making Matango after Godzilla. And this is my favorite quote from the movie. It's like, you eat mushroom, you become mushroom, right? I mean, what's wrong with that, right? You actually have the mushrooms putting in some hallucinogenic substances into people who are very happy into becoming this kind of monstrous mushroom men later on in the film, right? So you do have the film where nature is taking over, but it's a very, very different attitude. So that gives us two very distinct attitudes to dealing with nature in eco-horror and in eco-Gothic. In eco-horror, usually something eats us. Nature turns on us. I mean, it takes revenge. We are the ones who are guilty of destroying nature. We are the ones who have a lot to answer for. And we are the ones who are victimized, right? In a beautiful shot of Audrey from Little Shop of Horrors trying to eat the girl. On the other hand, eco-Gothic is kind of more interested in changing our perspective. And it's trying to look at this human, non-human interconnectedness. So that shot coming from the Japanese movie, The Suicide Village, Shimizu's film, which shows you a character blending into the landscape. The character and the tree become something else. It's no longer a tree, it's no longer a character, it's a new ecosystem and it's a new possibility. So the eco-Gothic and the, related to its approaches, for instance, folk Gothic, right, are dealing a lot with the notion of the non-human. And the non-human, sometimes, it's not just the animal, not just the spirit, but it's definitely the, self-perpetuating drive of rituals, traditions, places, objects, anything that kind of dissolves. And what is interesting is that it changes our approach to what Gothic does. I mean, it does not scare you. It does not, induce anxiety and fear like horror texts. But what it produces is a sort of existential dread, because we suddenly lose our, privileged place at the center of the universe, right? We are no longer important. And this is what bugs us. It doesn't scare us, but it makes us think, right? I mean, I am only one person in a very large ecosystem, and I need to learn to coexist with this world. So in eco-Gothic, animism becomes a very, very strongly filled modality, right? And these texts are usually dealing with the forms of subjectivity. It's another way of looking at post-humans, right? The typical texts dealing with early post-humans were talking about the mergers of man and a machine, right? We talked about cyborgs, we talked about technology. This one is about something different. This is a kind of inugami-like creature, a human transforming into a dog god, in Japanese folk. These are the spirits that apparently exist next to us, right? The communities that are no longer different from the land that they inhabit. The land which is no longer an object. It's not a farmland that you buy and sell and you make profit from, but it's something that you dissolve into, something that's got agency. And what is really interesting is that in the eco-Gothic text or in folk Gothic text, what we realize is that we don't need to go anywhere. We don't need to travel to a forgotten land and meet monsters because we're already there, okay? We're already dissolving into that part. We're already trapped in that situation from which we do not have a way of leaving. It's also kind of related to, sometimes people call it cosmic, you know, eco-Gothic or eco-horror, right? Because it's this idea of being in a larger ecosystem and larger sort of, part of nature. So almost there, just 2 final slides. One of the other things that strikes us in these approaches are objects. Objects or things, okay, which suddenly appear in the stories. We don't know where they came from. You can't get rid of them. You can't destroy them. They seem to have power over us, over itself. They seem to have their own agency, and they definitely change the narrative of the stories. So one of the interesting metaphors that comes out of these texts, in which we can see how we belong, is the metaphor of possession. Many of these texts talk about possession. It brings us to the spirits again, right? So the possession, the possessed body, the body that is kind of animated by something, being a spirit, being, well, I don't know what animates it, object sometimes, which is kind of our entry into that new ecology. Something that is definitely bigger than human, something that can be very exciting, you know, can lead to some positive realizations, but can also be hellishly scary, right, in that part. Okay, so that's my tiny little intro, and I hope that that Elizabeth can take us into a different direction, and then we can bring it all together. Okay. Thank you. Can I just swap with you?
Awesome. Thank you, Kasia. All right. So I'm going to be responding to, in a way, to what Kasia mentioned about the Gothic, and I was struck by what you said about possession. So maybe if we use possession as an entry point to thinking about Total Pleasure Suite, we can maybe consider the question of who's possessing who in this body of work. So Total Pleasure Suite is really a project that looks at the reimagination of desire in controlled environments. It looks at the rhetoric of nature as pure and determined by some kind of divine. And this instead proposes a feral transformation that emerges from entangled ecosystems and access. So that's something that also Kasia mentioned as a characteristic of the Gothic. Total Pleasure Suite looks at this idea of this tension between nostalgia, between novelty, looking at greenwashed restoration of the city and technofuturism. It also looks at the forgotten pleasures that I am also framing as the Gothic, so sort of like a sidestep from your research and your practice. So Singapore, if I can just draw it back to the Pure Intention Biennale and Primal Instinct, has been situated as a product of what Rem Koolhaas mentioned as the seed of purity. And if we extrapolate it to Singapore today, Pure Intention assumes the form of this superstructure. And within this superstructure are mediated processes of extreme terraforming, of biological manipulation of nature, of climate control, of establishing the city-state as a biome. So this may be, surfaced in ways of smart city ventures. Intention may be thought of as pure or considered, but there are also perceptions that pure intention is benevolent. I argue the difference in this case, and thinking about how purity begets contamination and what lies in the wake of that minusing. So this means that purity may falter towards a ruthlessness, a prescriptivism, a universalism, an essentialism, all of the things that the Gothic also sidesteps. So ultimately, the city-state has also manufactured to become a well-oiled machine that has minimal tolerance for ferality. So to think and to be primal beholds an expectation of so-called nature as we know it. This cracks the lens that nature and this superstructure of nature is an act of God. It's also unfathomable, it's ungovernable. So to rethink primal instinct is to challenge our understanding of purity. When we're living in a time where possibilities feel that it's expanding, but also becoming very limiting, what can we find in turning to the alien, to the defiant, to the xeno, to the other? What can we find in this seductive reaction of sorts? So this diagram maps the ideological and material forces that the work navigates. So you can think about it as a pressure system. Forces are pushing down from above, thinking of ideas of the solar punk idealism, botanical liberalism, in the hopes of constructing a neo-Eden as we know it very clearly. I'm not going to point fingers at the buildings here, but you guys get the gist. And below that, this comfort simulacra, so the things of seamlessness, of smoothness, of climate control, of terraforming lice in that category. And this is the point where the cone meets the center, which is pure intention as I am responding to it. And this is the descending pressure of the official vision of the city-state, so everything that's controlled and authored. In the middle, we see the Gothic materialism band. This is the flat line, drawing from Mark Fisher. So the horizontal zone where the industrial complex reveals itself as this Baroque ecology, where the tropic Gothic, so this is where I'm drawing from Kassia's work, emerges. This is the crack, and it's neither ascending towards this Eden, but it's also not really descending, as I want to kind of situate the work into the xeno world, as I call it, but it's operating in between. So finally, when we get to the bottom, Primal Instinct, curated by Hothouse, this program sits within this framing. And we can think about the base as the xeno world. So instead of the more than human, what does the less than human mean? When we consider the phenomena of the tricksters, which actually Jason, who is our keynote speaker, will be discussing later, what else can we draw from this archetype of sidestepping in the crack, of playing the role of the alien in this format? So it's not really about choosing one side. In this case, it's about holding contradiction, and that's where Total Pleasure Suite comes into being and form. So just a little bit of historical context. I think I was approaching this idea of Total Pleasure Suite as understanding what is desire and what does that look like to pursue pleasure within this contradiction. So even if this bind isn't conscious or felt explicitly, how do interior and public spaces manage these desires? Can they become extensions or castrations of these primal drives? And so the skeletal inspiration behind the project was drawn from the playgrounds that were first built in the 60s to 70s in the heartlands of the HDB estates. And we see that the bodies move in very unconforming ways. Of course, they're kids, their wrists can bend at really terrifying angles, and their knees twat, and the way that the neck takes upon new shapes. These are what we say it's unconforming movements and unnormative forms that we don't necessarily afford. And that's, again, what the Gothic is trying to propose. It's new shapes of moving, and it's new shapes of occupying in reality. So I was drawn to these micro moments of joy, of rebellion as forms of entropy in the face of progress. So this became a core nodal inquiry into the development of the work. So Singapore's development, again, operates through a very simple mantra, which is displace, destroy, and replace. So clear the old, build the new, repeat, do it all over again. This city is created in this perpetual state of a tabula rasa. So this is about constantly wiping the slate clean. And so the work tries to question, is there another way? And can you devour space without transforming it completely, while making room for what doesn't fit the plan? So for the other, the excessive, the unintended. TPS well, I guess, yeah, it attempts to reverse this object-subject dynamic that Kasia also was talking about. So usually humans control objects, they activate spaces, they impose the intention. But here the objects activate the humans, which was the performance activation that we did in November. And the installation then talks about possession. And this is when the non-human agents, the less than human world, takes control. So these are essentially just the, well, my intentions from the pure intentions that I wanted to depure in a way. The first was thinking about creating paradoxes. So first, thinking about stasis and acceleration. Singapore can't stop building, but yet nothing fundamentally changes because it keeps being replaced at such an incredible speed. So perpetual motion that goes nowhere, and the project asks what emerges from this tension. And the second is about interrupting the seamlessness. Singapore aims for a total environment, referring again back to 𝘗𝘳𝘪𝘷𝘦, which is all about this complete, controlled, omnipotent space that is hyper-performing all the time. The project was trying to introduce this rupture, a gap, the break in that seamlessness. And the third is to unpathologize entropy. So what if decay, slowdown, breakdown aren't problems to solve, but conditions to work with? And the fourth is this idea of continuous rupture. So instead of building complete visions of the future, what if architecture and spaces operated through this ongoing interruption and rupture results in this idea that we're never settling, never arriving in the crack. And I know that's terrifying because that's very destabilizing, but I think TPS was offering this idea of what could be than a rather what should be. And so in this framing of the Gothic as pleasure, that was my way in. The installation becomes a monument for this necessary brutality, for the other, the opposition, to exist in this cultivated smoothness of the landscape. So it uses materials from what I framed as of the Gothic, so kind of different from what Kasia was framing it as. So in this work, it was the industrial that became the Gothic rather than the animalistic non-human. So we were thinking about a form that's neither an object or subject, a form that is ungiving, it's also undead and unliving. And this is where I got to this idea of building back a monstrous form. So not through folklore or mythology as probably what the work of Kasia looks at, but also through the industrial complex itself, the school furniture that we use, the tires, the infrastructural debris. So these are materials that are sidelined as specters, pushed to the margins, away from the center of excellence, away from this idea of pure intention. The installation drags them back in a way, and it reveals them as the primordial force that underlies all purity. So this sculpture is testament to how the Gothic is alive and kicking in a different kind of way, as seen through the documentation of the artifacts if you have visited the site. It also includes these material interventions that are comprised of this brutalist animism of sorts, of the less than human. And so if we think about this idea of Neo-Eden, we probably want to consider excellence at one end. And actually, sorry, it's meant to be reversed. So excellence and Eden are meant to sit on one side, but that would be a funny kind of entropy Eden pipeline. But if we just think about the oppositions between excellence and entropy, eschatology and making Eden, we might find that we can find some answers in the gap. So this was drawing from Mark Fisher, where he was devising this idea of the flat line. And the flat line is basically where everything exists, and the gap, the crack that widens between enhancement and entropy, between this amnesia and building Eden, that's where the space where bodies stop performing towards excellence and they start performing the gap and liminality and the Gothic itself. So I was interested in situating Total Pleasure Suite in this liminal space. So not as an installation that optimizes, but refines towards, neither does it refine towards excellence, but it's not either a presence that sits in this fatalistic decay, but it is an affect that holds you in this space somehow. It's a way of activating bodies toward neither this transcendence nor collapse narrative. And so maybe just to take it where Kasia was sort of framing the Western Gothic compared to the Asian Gothic, I started to think about how TPS responds to the Gothic and maybe creates its own derivative of this Asian Gothic. So I was considering how that ladders up to what the Gothic actually means. So you might be thinking like classical Gothic, that's all about, it's defined by time, so it's the past haunting the present. But in this installation, it was about the industrial that was haunting aspirations. If we think about decay, usually in classical Gothic, it's about, you know, the rotting woods, the crumbling of the facades of the buildings, but also the souls. I wanted to think about the excess here. So what is the material overflow, the surplus that you were also talking about? And if we think about nature as escape, that is a core tenet of classical Western Gothic literature. So this is all about the sublime, it's about the wilderness that can take you away. But here we want to see that nature is hyper-engineered, it's greenwashing on concrete. And if we consider the activations of temperature, of light, classical Gothic is all about the cold and dark, so it's about the mistiness, the gloom, the fog. But when it came to this work, it was about how can we bring in this idea of artifice through illumination, through using fluorescent lights from the LEDs, through working with humidity as well. So the key difference is that Western Gothic asks, what if the past won't stay buried? And this kind of Gothic asks, what if the future is already here and it looks like this? So Kasia writes that the Gothic installations produce spaces within spaces. I'm drawing from your essay. And each of them are capable of sustaining a microcosm of its own. But TPS doesn't actually contain, but it sprawls in its size. It doesn't create this idea of interiority, but it creates an atmosphere of oppression that bleeds outwards. So if we apply this logic of Tropic Gothic, the monstrosity isn't hidden, but it's very blatant. It's kind of an eyesore. The desire for manipulation isn't subtle, but it's piercing, and it's raw, and it's overtly unapologetic. So this is maybe what pure intention can become in the tropics. So it's not hygiene or clarified will, but pure in its refusal to disguise. And so tangentially, TPS was built from these impure agents. Again, that was something that Kasia was expanding on when she was writing that the Gothic form of installation is often determined by the use of media that embodies qualities that are deemed impure and abject. So two concepts that are frequently associated with Gothic and horror technologies. We can also go into this a bit more. So tangentially, we were just thinking of responding with, you know, this material excess of industry, or rather the industrial. So utilizing tires, latex-like tapes, strings, cable ties, fluorescent lights. So this was all drawn from the material vernacular of the so-called Tropic Gothic that I was reformulating. And it situates materials of the industrial, and it's also as a nod to the nightlife that I'm also framing tangentially as part of this Gothic. So thinking about the underbelly of the nation, thinking about the KTV lounges and so on and so forth. And the utilization of these like diamantes that are worn by hostesses, like it could be then viewed as a sort of a brutalist animism in a very different way. It can also be thought as a Baroque rendering of what the less than human looks like. Like, what if the less than human would claim a form? TPS was sort of this monolith of sorts. So our keynote speaker, Jason, argues that evil is tied to intelligence, not a moral intelligence, but a tactical, adapting, shape-shifting intelligence. The intelligence of the parasite, the trickster. So evil as refusal to be incorporated into the system. Maybe if we apply this to the logic of TPS, we can think about this is bypassing the object-subject line now, because we're situating them as intelligently impure and necessarily evil. So the way that the school furniture stacks itself precariously activates bodies in the ways that original designers never intended it for it to be. So you can't actually really sit on the school tables with this. You can try, but it's heavily advised not to. And this is a form of activating bodies in the ways that really sidestep normalcy. So going back to the original playgrounds that I was referencing. So this is a way trickster intelligence, so operating from the margins through cunning rather than power. Thinking about the trickster can't compete in official structures, so that because it can't, it subverts through this transformation of sorts by activating this evil. So we think about them as always shape-shifting, always surviving, always persisting, always obsessive. And these agents are evil because they refuse to behave as how pure intention demands. The installation has distributed malevolence, each component operating with its own tactical intelligence, comprising not through unity, but strategy and contamination. So this is really what I was trying to think about of as brutal animism, not a romantic animism that sees spirit in all things. We can also talk about that, but base animism that recognizes matter's capacity for deception and resistance. So the less than human that speaks through this impurity, not less intelligent, but differently intelligent, not more intelligent either. It's just a different kind of flavor. So operating outside registers that pure intention can recognize and control. I'm just wrapping up here, but I wanted to share this map of my framing around it. So we have the first bardo. So bardo is drawn from Tibetan mythology and Buddhist practices of the space between death and rebirth. So I was thinking about Bardo 1.0 on the left, as you see this primordial land, the swamp, the backwaters, the so-called virginal site of development. So moving up to Raffles Maxing, colonial excellence, transcendence through cognition, the founding mythology. So then a question lies here, it's incognito-ness, so what gets hidden in this narrative? And below we find swamp amnesia, so this is the artificial stasis, the frozen native under the master's gaze. This is Singapore's repressed past. Bardo 2 on the right, so Singapore's future fantasies. The idealism that I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of liberalism through botany, the green city vision, and above it, we have that comfort simulacra and pure intention, so the tactics and ideology that makes this future happen. Below, we had the blasphematics, which was the performance that refuses this trajectory. So the Gothic gap actually runs horizontally between them, connecting swamp amnesia to this industrial complex of Baroque ecology. So this is where TPS operates, not in this nostalgic swamp, and also not in the techno-optimist future, but in this gap of temporal regimes where the industrial reviews itself as the primordial. So that was kind of another baseline of the framing of the work. And so at the bottom, primal instinct and this xeno world, they're thinking of the less than human entities pushing up through those bardos and trying to exist obsessively, trying to seek existence and manifestation. So I'll now conclude, how does the Gothic live in Asia today? Through TPS, I have shown one possible answer, or maybe another question. It's about how it can mutate through local conditions of developmental acceleration, Singapore's manic building, its anxiety about decline, entropy, its swamp to smart city transformation pipeline within a couple of generations is incredibly impressive. So going back again to this idea of the Tantra, it actually means woven together. This offers a framework of sorts, so one whole made of fragmented selves, woven yet unconditionally autonomous from each other through destiny. This is what the tropical Gothic does materially. We see the table stacked precariously. We see this janky superstructure trying to exist and also not trying to hide of sorts. So Singapore's infrastructure can be thought of this idea as base matter that's performing as order. So returning back to the question of the Western Gothic, what if the past won't stay buried? The tropical Gothic asks, what if the future is already here, but made of this industrial debris that we tried to transcend, and this is a haunting of the industry. So this is distinctly what maybe we can call Asian Gothic forms reveal. The modernization that is repressed isn't behind us in ruins, but it's actually beneath us and it's within us, growing through the concrete right now, and it's also in the future. So this kind of xeno world operates through the trickster intelligence in the margins that we keep trying to smooth over. So my closing provocation is, what if we accepted that destiny itself is faltering, it's changing all the time, it gives way to the Gothic as such, so perhaps maybe even evil in its refusal to deliver us anywhere. And what if we designed for this darkness not as pessimism, not as fatalism, definitely not, but as operating in the dark mode, as operating in incognito outside the registers that pure intention can illuminate or control. So what emerges when we build these narratives and materials that operate through deception of tactics, when we choreograph our bodies moving through this fallible, incongruous destiny, we can acknowledge that the gap isn't a problem to solve, but the condition that we're already woven into. So the tropical Gothic reveals destiny operating in dark mode, so intelligently impure. It refuses transcendence, and it's precarious in holding the crack open. So yeah, I'll now conclude here, and maybe we can chat. Thank you.
Okay, we're back. Yeah, okay, so what we're going to do is Liz and Kasia are going to have a little bit of a discussion amongst themselves. We'll also take questions from the audience. So if y'all have questions, just like raise your hand. There's a mic going around too. Sorry. Or sit in, or come in front, yeah. Yeah, also, Raffles maxing is cursed, dude. Like, you know. Well, Liz has a bunch of questions for Kasia, maybe. You wanna,
Yeah, Kasia, I was really curious. Maybe it's the interference. Yeah, I was just curious in terms of how you. Maybe we don't need the mic, or do we?
We could just have the mic a bit further from us so that it doesn't have so much echo, yeah?
Yeah, okay.
I think people can hear us. Mm-hmm.
Yes, so I was just curious about maybe what your framing is of the more than human and what your responses might be towards the less than human, because the more than human is a very I guess, a very pervasive term, and it's ubiquitous in terms of if we think about ecological critical thinking, and that term has now been matured in a way, and there's a lot of like definitions that are tied to this term. I'm curious about how that relates to the Gothic and what the less than human could mean for you.
I think it's a very, very interesting question, and I'm kind of like thinking that when I was listening to what you were saying, I begin to realize that when I was only thinking in a term of more than human, right? It kind of seems like you are drawing the ecology in which the humans are only a part, and there is something that is bigger, right? But I kind of now realize from listening to you that every time we say more, it implies that there could be less, right? I mean, it's just a question of language, right? And the problem is that if we start talking about both more and less, then we are still centralizing the human. So the human becomes the yardstick, right? And it's something that is more than human and less than human, and that becomes a little bit more problematic. But I see it that it's actually something that Gothic does. I mean, Gothic itself is very much drawn to borders, right? I mean, you said purity, impurity, object, and something that we accept, and situating itself in the crack in between or somewhere. But ironically, it's also kind of reinscribing those borders, right? Because if it tells us that the borders kind of unsettle us, it's like it cannot unsettle us if we dissolve the borders completely. Yeah. If we accept that, like, oh, we don't care about purity, impurity, and we are just happy with this kind of in-betweenness and the hybrid and everything, there wouldn't be a hybrid anymore. Because a hybrid only makes sense if we are kind of situating it in this world of these rigid parts. That Gothic both seeks to kind of go beyond and like go sort of like we have the werewolf, which is neither human or wolf or something, but at the same time the werewolf is Gothic because it's neither human nor animal, right? Yeah. So there is this kind of circularity, and I think that the more than human and less than human is also something that goes into it. So maybe I just bounce the question back to you. Do you think that the less than human is because it's industrial, because the industrial is kind of human made rather than natural?
Yeah, exactly. Answered my answer.
Sorry, I'm just trying to put the computer closer so that he can hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Who can? Oh, it's Eva.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it could be used in a way, or at least when I have encountered the terms less than human, it's almost of irony, and thinking about how we can, in a way, like subvert this object-subject dynamic. So actually maybe not converting the object to a subject, but reversing the dynamic in terms of actually maybe the object is higher than the subject, and there's no need to name change. So yeah, that was also my one of the initial thoughts that I had around it. But yes, definitely, I think because it's made by the human, like, is it actually less than human, and can we reframe the name? And I don't think there's a need to perhaps try to make the object the subject, because that would be sad.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, the problem is always that once you start bringing definitions and terms into it, right, it kind of like, it's exciting because you're trying to come up with some answers and some possibilities, but there is always the cracks that are revealing itself. It reminds me of that definition of the eerie that Mark Fisher had, like the presence where there should be absence, and the absence where there should be presence, right? And so in the case of the industrial, it's something that sometimes we sort of sense it, that it's something that was designed for humans, and once you take the humans out of the question, right, it becomes something haunted, something uncanny, right? It brings me back to the installations of Chihiro Shiota, and when she makes those dresses that are no longer worn and like chairs that nobody sits on. So something that is very much, it's intended for humans. However, it gains another meaning, and perhaps it's drawing on that nostalgia that you have. Not exactly the swamp, but it's drawing on that part that it sort of belonged to it, right? But then again, I'm kind of wondering. I mean, are we just trying to still cling to this notion of control? Because if we evoke that, like, oh, it's missing a human, is a human absence. Like, is it because we still want to be important? In that sense, we want that dress to miss us and that building to be a part of it. What do you think?
I'm just trying to think of a way to phrase it without sounding cynical. But yes, I do believe the ego is definitely present and will continue to remain.
Maybe that's where the dread comes in.
That's where the dread comes
in. We can't cope with this, so we're like, please let us be back.
But yeah, Helios, do you have any questions?
I know we have somebody in the audience.
Hey guys, you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, I have a question for both of you guys. Do you know the 𝘗𝘓 by Dr. Seuss? Right? Would the 𝘗𝘓 fit under eco-Gothic, at least the loose definition that you guys provided? And what are your opinions about it?
Okay, I'm just going to repeat the question for the sake of the folks on Zoom. The question was about the 𝘗𝘓
Yes, it's about the
by
𝘗𝘓.
Dr. Seuss.
Yes.
And the question was whether that counts as a kind of an example of the eco-Gothic. Yes? Is that?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm the terrible person to answer it because I actually don't know the 𝘗𝘓. Dr. Seuss, sorry, bad, Oh, this one. Okay. I don't think I know enough. It's orange. Do you know the 𝘗𝘓?
I know of the 𝘗𝘓, but I don't really know its personality very well. But yeah, I guess maybe it could. I mean, it's funny to try to categorize the Gothic because it kind of supersedes them, but we also need the categories and the typologies to kind of navigate them a little bit more. I would be pressed to say perhaps the eco-Gothic, based off of what Kasia was referring to in terms of the films that she was referencing, where it's this strange, monstrous form, but I guess the way that it's been cutesified for children also makes the monster accessible, and it makes the monster less scary. Do you think the horror has been taken out of the 𝘗𝘓?
I mean, as a person who has absolutely no idea about what 𝘗𝘓 or who 𝘗𝘓 is, that's a very difficult question to answer. No, I don't see that characters particularly Gothic from the pictures that are in front of me. So I'm sorry, I don't really know how to answer it because I don't know enough, so I can't draw on that.
Hello? Could I give you a synopsis of the 𝘗𝘓?
Okay.
And what its character is? The 𝘗𝘓 is basically called this forest spirit that is trying to stop the invasion, or at least the deforestation of his environment. And in this story, humans are running out of oxygen, and oxygen is like big capital. They are making and manufacturing oxygen, and the forest is the last place that the 𝘗𝘓 is trying to hold off from the humans, from trying to steal oxygen from them. And in this category where he is a forest spirit, would you classify that under eco-Gothic?
Okay, so I see how it can be tempting, but the one problem that I have with it is you told me that he has an intention to save the forest and to do something, right? Now, in eco-Gothic, I don't think that the spirits have any intention. They just are. I mean, intentions are very human, right? Because intention brings in the narrative. I want to do something. I have a motivation. I have a goal. I have a project. I have a desire, right? And this is very anthropomorphic. So once we do it, once we impose it, we're like imposing the human logic on the character, and we are anthropomorphizing this character, and that would be closer with eco-horror. But I don't think it's a horror scenario in this case, right? I mean, if 𝘗𝘓 started eating people who destroy the forest, then maybe we would have an eco-horror narrative. But in eco-Gothic, I think he would be simply just there, okay? And the humans would not be able to understand what's going on. I mean, we are basically lost in these narratives because we try to impose some logic. I mean, if the spirit hates me, then I'm important, right? I'm someone to be hated, right? But if the spirit completely ignores me, is oblivious of my intention, and I can just die because of an accident, and it's absolutely, I mean, yeah, that's eco-Gothic. That's the Cthulhu coming for you, in a cosmic form, but it's in a forest, okay? So I don't know if that answered your question. I don't know if it works for Lorax, but based on your synopsis, that would be my answer.
It does. Thank you.
Running a little bit short on time, but I think we can take one final question from the audience if anybody has anything really pressing. Going once, going twice. All right, well, let's thank Liz and Kasia. All right, we're gonna take a much shorter break this time around, like actually 5 minutes, I think, and then back here for the keynote. See you guys.